Welcome back to ATTV. I'm your host, Ben McLeod, founder of Convey Bio, and I'm here today with Tom Smith, Strategic Director of the Cell and Gene Therapies from Uniphar. Tom, can you give me a brief introduction about your role within the organization, and what do you think we're going to be seeing over the next couple of years in cell and gene therapy?
Sure, great Ben, good to be here. So Uniphar, we do quite a lot of cool things across the pharmaceutical and med technology businesses. So just to unpick a few layers there before we dig into the main content, I guess. So we partner with over 200 companies and we support companies throughout the life cycle of pharmaceutical development. So Excellent. Right from early stage through our medical teams building out a scientific platform and then right down the nitty-gritty end, if you like, with patient access, which is hopefully where we'll spend most of our time today chatting about. So my role within the organisation is relatively new, heading up the strategy for our cell and gene therapy business.
Excellent.
So that kind of shows the strategic intent of Uniphar to really delve into this part of the industry, and that's based on some of the experience and learnings that hopefully we'll share with the audience today as we go through the discussion. Good question on trends. Where do we start with that? So I'll try and keep my remarks relevant to where we play and what we call is in our influential sphere. So being largely European based, although we are in the US, we do see skepticism over the European markets, driven by a number of companies in this space being largely US based. So we've seen a number of products come onto the market in the US but haven't yet made it outside of the US yet. Right. So we see that as strategically relevant for us as an area we can support companies expand their access to the cell and gene therapies. Also, they're increasingly being born out of academia and scientific background, and the science is really, really good. And in the Investor Day yesterday, a lot of the talk was around translating that science into access and patient access, and also how do you monetize the good science, because ultimately that's what keeps the businesses going. So that was a great topic in terms of the investor conference yesterday, and then just a soundbite from a discussion that we had at JPM last week was just kind of the way that companies are interacting with their investors in terms of whether to partner out or whether to use a service such as like an outsourced commercialization in terms of retention of value for the longer term for the asset. And then ultimately what we do is for patients. So that will be my last remark in terms of the trend, and we don't see any relenting in the desire to get access to these therapies, particularly where there's a high unmet need. And that kind of spans the globe, where we're seeing those pressures come from patient organisations, rightly so, because patients need these therapies to help themselves.
Yeah, that's the reality we're seeing. Again, like sometimes we can get a little bit down about the cell and gene therapy industry, but there are cures here that cannot be found in any other sort of therapeutic modality. So we really need to keep that in mind, especially with regards to patients who need them, and there is unmet need. No one else is able to provide that.
Yeah, and the curative element, or hopefully curative element of some of these, particularly the gene therapies, is a totally different treatment paradigm, which needs to be handled slightly differently.
Exactly. Excellent. So tell me a little bit more about Uniphar. What are you guys working on inside of the cell and gene therapy space? How can you help companies?
Yeah, so we've been really fortunate actually to be working in the cell and gene space for the past 7 years. That journey started when we were asked, can we do something called an expanded access program, which we've done for 25 years for other modalities and other therapeutic areas, for a gene therapy, for a high unmet need, really emotive kind of ask, where there's patients around the world in desperate need of obtaining the therapy. So that was where our journey started 7 years ago. Since then, we're thrilled to have been able to supply access to over 600 patients in 50 plus markets, which is something when we started the journey we just did not think was going to be within the realms of possibility, given the complexities that we foresaw. So we're thrilled for the patients and their ecosystem and their caregivers that have been able to benefit from that. Just to refer back to that comment I made around the investors and monetizing that's equated to about $500 million in revenue for companies, which then can get reinvested and also provides a sustainable platform for access to these therapies earlier in their life cycle than perhaps they otherwise would. And when you think around the natural history of some of these diseases, unfortunately some of the patients would have succumbed to their disease if they don't get treated earlier than they would have done if the product wasn't, if we waited until commercialization in their country. So that's where it started. Since then we've touched around 10 assets various different ways in terms of building up strategy versus implementation, and there'll be more programs coming live during 2025, which we're thrilled about. But what that means is, where we've learnt from the different programs, we've now built up I call it our cell and gene therapy ecosystem and platform, which we're then plugging these assets into, to hopefully, ultimately get access to more patients in a more expedited way, and support companies to be able to do that.
Excellent, very good. For those who aren't familiar, what is an EAP?
Sure, it's a great question, and depending on who you ask, you'll get a totally different answer. So I'll just set the stage by what it means to us, and then that kind of will give context as to the rest of the discussion. So EAP stands for an expanded access program. Within Uniphar, we use that term to describe providing access to a therapy before it's commercially available in a country. Now, typically that will be even prior to regulatory approval, but in countries where there's a prolonged pricing and reimbursement negotiation, we'd see that an expanded access program is able to plug that gap as well.
Okay.
So the audience may be familiar with lots of different terms: early access, managed access, compassionate use. And in each jurisdiction around the world, that means something very different. So that's why we've just kind of elevated it up to an umbrella term to capture all of those. Within those different segments, there are programs that can be sponsor initiated, and they might be targeted for groups of patients, and therefore if there's a cohort of patients that meet specific criteria, they can get access. Or there might be more physician-led activities where they can request permission from their regulatory authority to import the unlicensed medicine. And also there's a spectrum there of whether product is supplied on a free of charge or charged for basis. So what does that mean in the context of cell and gene therapy, and what have we seen being done so far? There's probably been a bias towards what we would call kind of named patient access. So that means that access is being, permission to import is being sought on a patient basis. And by and large, it's being provided on a charged for basis. And there's different points of view on that. But I think the key takeaways there are focusing on equity of access. And by charging, you remove the geographical bias that can be seen with some of the free of charge compassionate use programs, where there might be an increased tendency to go to eventual commercial countries. And also the sustainability of access, when you think about high cost of goods, and then the balance sheet of some of the companies. So it really enables increased access to broader territories by using the tools in that way, and those kind of mechanisms of access.
Interesting. So if I were a cell or gene therapy company, why would I want to use an EAP?
Sure. So the ultimate aim is access, and that has to be the aim. So it has to be in response to an unsolicited request from a physician. But what we've seen is a number of layers of benefits for our partners and sponsors of the programs as we've kind of spun up these programs and facilitated access. So I'll just reiterate the broader access to patients in territories that wouldn't otherwise be able to receive access, and therefore having engagement with those patient groups earlier in the development cycle on a broader geographical scale is very helpful for the companies. It encourages earlier discussions and interactions with regulators and payers, and the intent from physicians, them going out of their way to prescribe a product and ask for access, can give leading indicators to regulators and payers as to what the clinical outlook for these assets may be. And that early site engagement is really helpful as well. There's some complexities around administering these therapies and handling these therapies, so there can be quite an extensive timeline to set some of the treatment sites up. So that process is already happening just by virtue of responding to an unsolicited request, and it gives the physicians increased confidence and exposure to the product.
Gotcha.
You can also then align the EAP to a commercial strategy for the asset. So you don't have to say as a sponsor, I'm going to respond to every request and have to fulfill every request. That's not what it's about.
Right.
So you can take strategic decisions in terms of where geographies may be possible to supply, thinking about supply chain capacity, manufacturing capacity, which might be rate limiting steps. But that infrastructure that's been built up, and using supply chain as an example, the paradigm for the cell and gene therapies, which are very much distributed per patient or directly from manufacturer, actually that infrastructure that we're seeing being set up for the expanded access program can then be continued post-commercialization. So actually, once you've then got a regulatory approval and you've concluded your pricing and reimbursement discussions, it's then a shorter time frame to then be able to mobilize that commercial infrastructure because you're actually leveraging what you've already got.
Okay. Yeah, so definitely something that everybody should be taking advantage of. Makes sense. You mentioned earlier that you've helped get it different therapies into something like 50 different markets.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about that, taking cell and gene therapies to countries for the first time. Like, I imagine there's all sorts of different challenges associated with that. Like, what have you guys experienced?
Yeah, and we've got a number of battle scars on our back under the jacket from going there for the first time. And I suppose there has to be an element of a risk appetite to have done what has been achieved, and that's not single-handedly on us with the sponsors that we've collaborated with to enable that. So just to touch on some of the key success factors, if you like. We talk about challenges, but if we can spin them into success factors, then that is brilliant.
Yeah.
So understanding and embracing the opportunity to work in a new way.
Yeah.
These one-time therapies, deep freeze products, different supply chains, different ways of different treatment journeys, right from diagnosis through to treatment, is something that we've seen the success of, and it really embracing and understanding that. But we totally acknowledge that needs to take organizations and stakeholders on a journey. So that where companies are doing this best is just resetting and almost unlearning some of the things that they may have learned with other therapies and more traditional therapies and modalities to really level set what is optimal for this therapy, this disease state, and this treatment pathway.
Right.
From a regulatory standpoint, when we first started doing this, some of the regulators were silent on the gene therapy regulations for the unlicensed import, and some of the regulations were kind of contradictory to what was required to bring the product into the country. So we've done a bit of work with a few of the regulators to mould the way that the regulations are utilised and applied to facilitate the appropriate methods of bringing products into those countries. Training sites I've touched on already, but that is particularly when you're going to countries further afield than what would be a normal launch sequence. The understanding of the one-time therapies, the natural capabilities that a site would have can introduce complexities. And one thing that I'd just comment on there is that the notion of a one-time therapy, that headline isn't always helpful when you think in terms of the whole treatment journey of that patient. Yes, they've had their one-time gene therapy, but then there might be follow-up adjunct therapies, steroids, or follow-up appointments that are required. So making sure that is well understood in all the territories where expanded access is given, it is really important. In terms of the supply chain, moving products into different countries where there might not be an airport next to the treatment centre, moving some of these therapies by road and thinking about the re-icing requirements, that's where we collaborate with our logistics partners on that element, but then also clearing customs with these therapies, the time pressure to get them through, and some of the complexities we've seen with the level of duties and taxes that will be applied on such a high value product.
Right.
Even if it's being supplied for free, if they know it's on the market in a country at a value, then navigating that landscape. And I suppose the last remark would just be managing those high value transactions across international borders, across currencies, with exchange rates. And we've developed a nice contractual structure and matrix that we get into with the relevant stakeholders to facilitate that in a nice way.
Awesome. Makes a lot of sense. Describe what steps companies are taking to realize the opportunities of EAP.
Yeah, increasingly we're seeing companies engage in this type of discussion much earlier than we would with other modalities, even as early as phase 1. And I think that's a symptom of the pressure to have that answer to investors and stakeholders. How are we affording access later down the path? How are we turning this science into access?
Right.
And secondly, the rate that some of these assets are coming to through regulatory approval is probably diminishing some of the time that companies would normally have to be able to prepare themselves for commercial launch. So even as early as phase 1, we're engaging in these discussions. And depending on the company's approach and the build-up of their portfolio of products, there's a couple of different ways that it's being tackled. If it's a single asset company, then they may think about specifically that asset strategy and their commercial aspirations for that asset, their access aspirations for that asset, so that it's really tailored to that requirement. Other companies might have a portfolio of cell and gene therapies, might start first with a company approach with some key themes and ethos and an approach that then can be applied throughout the portfolio. The most complex we've come across is where there's a diverse portfolio of cell and gene and non-cell and gene assets, and just the different ways that has to be managed. Typically, we're seeing the EAP go live in global markets alongside the FDA approval. That's what we're typically seeing.
Right.
And that's when the companies have enough product and the physicians have relevant confidence in the asset to treat their patients with a good risk-benefit ratio. And then my last comment would just be how those infrastructures, learnings are then being utilised as these assets come to regulatory approval and being commercialised in global markets as well.
Very good. Makes sense. Awesome. Well, how can people get in contact with you if they want to learn more?
So we're around all week, so feel free to reach out to us on the Facilitate app, and we'd love to engage in any discussions any way that we can help. Also check out our LinkedIn page, and you can access us through there as well.
Excellent. Great to meet you, Tom. Thanks for taking us through it.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Thank you.